Well, hey,
Sure.
team.
Thanks a
Michael
lot.
Derbyshire here, account executive at Mooven. Quick introduction. Mooven is the infrastructure delivery platform focused on delivering your projects faster, safer, and more efficiently. The reason for this webinar today is that we've just been hearing about a ton of the great work that DOTs are doing on all things work zone safety. We recently met with the Maryland Department of Transportation and all kind of the great work that they're doing to make work zones just safer and more efficient overall. So today's webinar is just really about the importance of work zone safety and how do we really drive measurable change within those work zones. Just a really common thing that we keep hearing is, how do we drive that change and how do we unlock that actionable insight? So today our CEO and founder, Misha Gabriels, is going to go ahead and walk us through some of the latest findings on all things work zone safety. So Misha, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to kick things off.
Cheers, Michael. As Michael said, I think what we see a lot is this huge focus on how do we help improve safety. And the big thing which we'll look to cover today is, where there's some practical ways which we can drive that now, and where there's some practical ways which we can really understand what's going to shift the dial within that. So what I'll do is I'll just cover a little bit of an introduction, cover two particular topics, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers as well. So just actually one more piece of context. So this one here is around data-driven safety. The next two webinars, which we've got coming up in the series, is one around paving and maintenance. So all this kind of smaller jobs which you need to do on the road and corridor. And then the last one on this list here is around how we can turn that kind of fear of complaints and the pressure around complaints into an opportunity if we're looking to deliver work. So how can we go about driving positive change through the pressure which we get to reduce the impact from roadworks and construction. So worker safety is a really, really major issue at the moment, and we see this in a large number of different markets which are really trying to grapple with, like, how do we get to a position which we're not having so many fatalities on the road, and how do we make a meaningful change in something which can be pretty hard to drive a change in, simply just from the amount of people driving on the roads and the amount of active roadwork sites which are live. There's this real interesting challenge about, with all of that activity going on, how do we drive a meaningful change? And we see this pop up more and more. As Michael was saying, there's a recent incident which kind of came to our attention out of Maryland, and a crash through a work site ended up killing 6 workers, and it's these really kind of tragic events. But the problem is it's not that uncommon, and it just really happens a lot. So there's this real interesting drive at the moment for going, how can we go about putting initiatives in place which look to change this situation, so that we don't have to worry about people not coming home at the end of a shift, or also just the motorists going through a roadwork site being injured or hurt or killed themselves. So when you step back from the kind of a lot of the topics in the conversation which is going on at the moment, and a lot of that focus has been on behaviour change campaigns around enforcement of speed through work zones and things like that. One of the things which was seen as some common trends and some of the common challenges here is that speed through the work zones is the primary risk which is resulting in fatalities and issues from the sector. And that's causing deaths, as I mentioned, to both crews and motorists themselves. But there's a real lack of data and visibility around the individual work sites and around the volume of work which is going on. So while speed's known to be the major issue, most of the teams who are out on the road on a regular basis are largely blind to what's going on their particular work site, besides them raising their own kind of feedback just about being there on the road, seeing it, feeling it, and seeing something going past. Now, we're seeing a lot more hardware starting to be used, so ways of trying to physically put monitoring out on the side of the road to capture some data on this, and it's providing some really, really valuable insights. And we've seen some teams do some quite amazing work with some of the insights which they've gathered from there. But one of the things which we're really seeing come up is that's really hard to scale to every single job and every single location. So it can be both cost prohibitive from the fact of having to deploy it and the costs associated with the hardware, but it's also really prohibitive because you're putting people in harm's way in the process of trying to get this data. So, we're trying to make the road safer. The last thing which we want to be doing is putting more people into live traffic on more occasions to try to solve that problem. And so with that, what you're seeing is a lot of like very rich data, but from only a few number of kind of fixed points. And so I think that's really making it a little bit more challenging often to go, how do we step back and how do we assess where we should be focusing, where we can put our most amount of effort, and how we drive an impact there. And the last point which is on here is around those kind of barriers to action. So with that lack of visibility, which there is today, with a lot of the hardware kind of based collection, what we're finding is that within those two aspects, you may get some information, but that information is most likely going to come to the team involved maybe a month later or 6 weeks later or something similar. And so the challenge with that is you can kind of go back retrospectively and get a bit of a sense. So it helps, and it helps quite a lot from policy and behavior change aspects. But it's really, really hard to change what actually occurred on that site, on that day, or while a job is live. And the kind of cruel piece here is that often like the nuances of each job and each location are quite different. So you get to the situation which, while you can kind of apply the learnings in a generic sense, is actually really hard to drive an actionable change associated with the piece of work zone activity which is going on to actually like end up reducing that risk and resulting in the end outcome which we want, which is a safer environment. And so we've really been thinking about this framework where we're going is there's a lack of visibility, there's some real challenges with understanding where to focus, and there's some real challenges about how do you drive an actionable change, not in several years' time, but next month or next week. And so the remainder of this webinar will look at those components, and we'll look at what are some of those factors affecting safety and what's a way or a methodology you can think about what to consider and how you start looking at that approach to make risk-based decisions. And then secondly, how do you go about achieving measurable outcomes? So we'll just go through a real life example which Mooven was involved in, and a team who was struggling with safety, how they approached the issue, and then what they ended up achieving. So coming to the factors which impact safety first. So we're going to break this down into two parts. One is looking at what influences safety, and then the second part is how can we think about gathering information to inform safety through work zones. So the first one, we're thinking about what impacts safety. One of the things which we've seen is it can sometimes be quite a one-dimensional conversation. So it's just looking at only speed, for example, and the location. I think the problem which we see with that is when you try to make an actionable change, you kind of need a little bit more context about what is going on. And so when we've been thinking about this, we've broken this down into a model where there's a whole range of influences which come together, and they're all kind of nestled within each other. So the first one of the influences, which is really, really important and should always be considered, is the fixed context. So examples of this would be the road geometry and setup, the asset conditions. So like how old is a road? Like has it still got good skid resistance? What kind of typical crash history has occurred in that area? And the physical location of that area might change that. So these factors are fixed. They're not going to change, and they've got to do with the kind of build environment which it's sitting in, but provide a really important piece of context for what goes on for the next steps. Often what you'll see is quite different safety patterns occurring simply based on the road location, geometry, or other setup. So like it's something which should not be ignored. And when you're physically on the road, you can often see this and really feel it. So, example could be a blind corner or like a road which crests and you can't see over it. So things like that are actually really, really important into work zone safety and considerations for it. The next component is around the variable context. So this has got to do with, okay, what are traffic speeds doing? Not just as an aggregate average, but over the last week, over the last month. How does that change by time of day, by day of the week? How does that change based on the weather or the season or things like sunstrike? Are we seeing that safety and speed through work sites change around holidays? So we'll just have Thanksgiving, are holiday times occurring and there's more speeding going on, or is there less? Like, what contributes to that? The level of traffic which is on there, how does that contribute to what we're seeing occurring? And so that variable context ends up being incredibly important if you want to make risk-based decisions about what you're doing going forward. Because once you understand some of those variables, then you can look at a future situation and understand what may be impacting safety within that work zone. The third element is around the worksite factors themselves. So different types of temporary traffic management will result in different levels of speed compliance. There's the physical length of the project. Is it the length of time the project's there? Is it when the project's manned and active versus not? It can even be things like which contractor is involved, what traffic management company is involved, what type of on-site activities going on. Is there something there which is distracting drivers? So these on-site factors are all things which can influence how safe or unsafe an environment is and how people and motorists interact with that work zone. And then the last thing when we're thinking about work zone safety impact is what are those interventions which we can do, and how do people respond to those interventions? And I think one of the really interesting things when you get a little bit deeper into this is you can also start to look at maybe not all interventions work the same way at the same time. So maybe some interventions are very good for night works or for controlling certain types of situations, and other types of interventions are better during the day in different setups. And so I think if you really want to understand work zone safety, you need to understand those different variables, because your strategy, the way which you might address safety, might be quite different depending on the type of intervention you're deploying within that context of what's going on the work site, what's going on the road and corridor, and then like what location you're actually in as well. Once you can get an understanding of some of these variables, it becomes much, much easier to make a data-driven decision about what are you actually going to do to mitigate that safety risk, and have you got the ability to measure the realized benefit and to be able to isolate that realized benefit from anything else which is going on. So now flipping this over from the factors which we should be thinking about to switching to more of like how would we think about a project and a project's life cycle. One of the really exciting things we're seeing coming up is a move to more risk-based frameworks, as opposed to just like a process-based framework, which goes, we're on this type of road, so we follow this type of practice. Within these risk-based systems, what you're starting to do then is, rather than just following a blanket set of rules, which have been designed with the best intention, with the best information possible, you're flipping that over and going, how do we actually understand what is going on in this location, and how do we inform what we do based on the observed conditions and the observed risk, and make our decisions more effective because of that. So there's really three parts to this. The first part is, how do we gather the information to make those risk-based assessments? And a really powerful, simple way of doing this is even something as simple as looking at the speed on that road corridor before you go out and do the work. Now, if that speed is assumed to be at the posted speed limit, but you actually can see that a lot of people are speeding in that area, you might want to change or adjust how you're going about that work zone or the traffic management plans. Having that baseline before you've even begun work as well also helps you to understand how effective your mitigation measures are. So one of the things which can come up is, if you've got a lot of speeding in that area, you may not think you've brought down the speed as much as you would have liked, but actually you may have brought down the speed more than you realized. Another really important component with this is also just not looking at this at a single point. So often there's a single point which that data is captured, but we've seen some really interesting and really insightful results when you can start to look at speed on the approach to the work site, speed on the entry into the work site, so into the slowdown areas. And if the work site's large enough, even the speed in different zones within that work site, and then on the way out. So like a practical example of this might be you have people slowing down through the start of the work site. Maybe you've got some interventions there which you're trying to use to slow the traffic down, but by midway through, the traffic speeds have crept back up. And so again, having that context to be able to make a risk-based decision really helps you to tailor what you're doing and how you're approaching that. With that, one of the things coming to the second point here is around being able to continuously monitor that. So one of the challenges, if you only have samples information, or if you only got sporadic information from sporadic projects, it's really, really hard to get to an understanding of where do we put our focus and what kind of trends are we seeing? Like what kind of patterns are we seeing which help us to adjust and actually drive meaningful change in the realized outcome with that. So having that ability to see how that site is performing over time, or how multiple sites are performing over time, builds up this incredibly rich data asset, which can be used to then inform and predict how we think we're going to go about future jobs. And that leads into that piece about reporting and measuring that change. So you'll see in the case study which we present at the end, was really, really interesting when you have that ability to measure what you're doing, what you can do in that circumstance and what might come up. So jumping to the case study now and just kind of talking a little bit about how this goes. So this example here, what was occurring is there's concrete remediation work which was occurring on a bridge. So the bridge had 4 lanes of traffic to another direction, and the dimensions of the bridge meant that the teams who are working, the crews who are working, were working in a really narrow site area right adjacent to the live traffic. And there really wasn't a lot of physical space for them to kind of create more of a buffer for a safer environment. Now, what ended up happening is the crews started raising concern about speed through the work site. And there was real concern from their part that they're going, it's just really not safe. Like we've got a lot of cars going really, really fast by us. When Mooven got involved, really the first step of this is to go, is this problem real in this location? Because the same kind of story comes up quite often. And then if it is real, like what are we going to do about that? So the action which was taken is the team was able to deploy monitoring in this location, speed monitoring in this location within a couple of hours. So the conversation happened early in the morning. They could straight away get into Mooven, set up the links which they wanted to, and start capturing that information about speed in these problem areas. One of the things which they did, as I kind of spoke about earlier before, is they didn't just look at the work site. They also looked at the approach to the work site and the exit through the work site. So they had a bit wider context about what was going on and what that wider behavior was. Now, what this led them to be able to do is immediately after the first shift, they could identify that, yes, speeds were coming down at the start of the shift in that one shift, but then what was happening is during the latter parts of the shift and overnight, the speed was returning back to a normal level. And so becoming a really, really unsafe environment. As you can see here, where there's a marked drop in speed at the start when work was commencing. And then by about 11, kind of 12, it starts to pick up a little bit, but then by 1, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., it's gone right back up and actually higher than it is during the general day. So, really quite an unsafe environment there at that time. So with this information, and then they could keep monitoring that shift after shift, they could immediately spot that they had an issue, and they immediately understood kind of what was going on with that. I think the really, really interesting one here is like, they had a couple different options about what they could do. So they set about putting some speed mitigations in there. So they changed some of the traffic management layout to try to make that site safer and to try to bring down the speed. Now, that often happens, and that's kind of the end of the story. And so the assumption is we've made a change, we think this is going to make it safer, and then probably the only time we'll really review it is we keep getting that pushback from the staff. What this team was able to do, though, is they were able to watch that. So what happened is they made that mitigation, they put it into place, but then what they found out was that it really wasn't driving the change which they're wanting to. So while all kind of general knowledge would say that should have worked, it really wasn't working at all. So by being able to continuously monitor it and understand, they could see what was going on. What they end up then doing is going through several other changes. I think from memory is the fourth change which they made, the fourth strategy which they went with, which is the one which actually resulted in being able to bring down those speeds in that area. So like that was a really profound and kind of different way of thinking for safety for the team, because rather than having to kind of throw an idea at the wall, everyone was really engaged in it and trying their best to do something, they could actually try something and they could check if it worked. And if it didn't work, they could try something else and then they could check again. And so that's the kind of thing which we're incredibly proud about, is where you can actually drive a measurable result in a relatively short order with that. Because at the end of the day, if we're not making that area safer, we really haven't achieved the result which we want to do, even if we could have understood what was going on afterwards. What we drove with this team as well is the ability for them to get real-time alerts on that as well. So as we built up a bit of history and understood the pattern, we could see if there's something which is outside of the norm and let them know about that. So again, there's not always a lot you can do immediately on that shift, but actually just raising awareness and making sure that was visible is a really important factor. And not in this particular scenario, but in other scenarios, there is things which you can do. And we see some of our customers go to the full extreme of just going, if we're really not comfortable that it's safe, we're just going to stop operations in this area. So you can go to quite an extent about how you might want to approach that. Now, one final aspect on this particular example here, and then I might just jump to Mooven just to show you kind of how easy it is to set up and capture information, because I think that's one of the points which is really, really important to kind of grasp here, is that it's doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to be a big expensive study to get that first view. So one of the things we wanted to do with this particular example on the MacArthur Bridge was there was an established pattern of using some hardware, and so there's a lot of knowledge around that, and there's kind of trust and understanding of that. So what we did is we also got 2 hardware units deployed in this area so that we could feed that data into Mooven. So that came in on a daily basis. So then every morning you could see both all the live speed data which was coming through and the traffic data, but you also got the data coming off these hardware devices to inform what was happening. And I think the thing which has become really clear from this and other indications is that data just correlates really, really well with that floating vehicle live data. So the floating vehicle data doesn't solve all problems, but we've seen it as this really useful technique to assess the relative risk of a whole range of sites very, very, very quickly, and also to see the relative impact of what you're changing. Now, there might be circumstances where you want to go further, and that's brilliant, because then you know you're investing in the right areas and you're focusing in the right areas. But one of the things which you often can't do is you can't go deploying hardware in every location around a single site or on every site. So we really wanted to have this way which we could broach both the how do I understand where to focus and how do I understand if I'm making a change, with the where do we want to go deeper and push harder and get more advanced. And with that, then it's a lot more comfortable to go, yep, we know we've got an issue in this area. We know we're still having progressive components where we need maybe a different view or a different lens or some additional information. But then that investment case is much, much easier because you know where you're putting that focus. So if I just really quickly switch over to Mooven here, this is just a site which I've drafted. It's not live at the moment, but it's just to give an example of how this might be approached. So we're looking here at 101 coming through the San Francisco Bay Area. So it's a major freeway. Now, the idea here is that you can very easily define, and I'll show you how to do this in a second, different areas of the work zone. So in this one here, I've set up the entry to the work zone, which is in the blue. I've set up a work zone area here in the red, and then I've got the yellow here, which is the exit to the work zone. Now, one of the things which you can immediately do as well is potentially look at the traffic going in the other direction. So for example, is there kind of rubbernecking going on? Is there a slowdown and impacts caused with that? Now, we've already talked about this idea of how you can look at speed through the entry, work zones, and other areas to inform stuff. But with this as well, something which we often find really, really interesting is there's the immediate work zone impacts, but sometimes there can be impacts further away. So I know this area pretty well myself. I drive it a lot. So if you're driving on 101 North here, you really can't see what's going on beyond this interchange here. So actually looking at the speed which is occurring kind of well prior to any of the traffic management can have real implications for that team. So if you're seeing a lot of speeding occurring there, you know that people are going to be running really hot into the start of your work zone area. So you might want to make some changes. You might want to have a look at what you could do there. So that could be as simple as deploying a mobile changeable message sign up here just to do some additional forewarning of that. The other thing which you can pick up is if you were getting quite a lot of kind of congestion and slowdown here associated with your work site here, now that it also creates a risk. So that creates that risk of having incidents which occurred as people are kind of approaching the work site. So a nose to tail occurring as people slow down. So again, you might want to take a different approach. Just using this as an example. So the ability to capture anything which you're interested in is super, super easy within Mooven. So say, for example, in this case here, you might also have a situation where you've got traffic coming in from 92, which could also result in an impact. So if the work zone here started to back up and then traffic started to back up on the ramp coming into 92, maybe we actually create a real safety risk issue sitting back here where you've got some traffic coming off, which is suddenly starting to go very, very slow, as well as you've got traffic moving through on a very fast road there as well. So capturing that information can just be as simple as clicking A to B for wherever we want on that, and we've immediately got that road segment which we can start capturing. So I'm going to go 92 to 101, and then we can just create that, and then that would be one of those segments which you could start monitoring. If you found during the project that was causing an issue, again, you can just keep coming back here and just adding additional information to this depending on how you wanted that to look. Now, you can make that longer, you can make that shorter. There's a whole heap of different ways which you might approach those strategies to have a look at what's going on, but it can give you that really interesting forewarning. So what we're seeing quite often with this is there might be circumstances where, if you had traffic build from the work site which you're on beyond a certain point, that may also create a safety issue where that could back up into another major intersection and cause an issue. So this whole concept of work site safety can go for both the work zone safety area itself, but also some of those surrounding areas. And one of the really interesting things here is as you can start to change the behavior of motorists with that, you can actually see and measure that result as it comes back to where the crews are, as well as any of the kind of wider motorist impacts. So I think we're pretty much bang on time. So I'm going to stop right there and just see if there is any questions, Michael, from anyone which we want to cover. And if not, we'll call it a day for this webinar.
Misha, I don't really see any questions currently, but great to dive into how we can just really understand the situation around us and really how can we unlock that data to drive a positive change. So
cool, awesome. I think maybe just covering off one question which sometimes does come up, which we can always cover, is kind of where do you get data from and how do you approach that? That's always a question which comes up. I think from our side, we're really invested in achieving an outcome. And so part of that means that we often have to look quite broad on the different data sets. And our role is to take whatever data we think is relevant and suck it through to enabling that outcome. So, if you're looking at safety, one of the really important ones, when we're looking at all this real-time traffic data, we think like getting the source of speed and vehicle data coming through in a way which doesn't require hardware is really valuable. So we've got integrations with floating vehicle data providers, which can provide that. That's really, really useful. A couple of different ones have got slightly different offerings. So sometimes we even use slightly different providers depending on what you're looking at for that. But then integrating in with the information you know already. So any existing information on volumes and count and telematics from the sites can be really, really useful. That gives you a good understanding of some of the triggers which may affect behavior. And then, like I talked about in those earlier areas, the more which we can put into Mooven from either context about what's going on the work site when it started and that activity which is going on, or supplementary information which we kind of mash together as well when you're kind of bringing it all together to analyze. I think that's really where you get this gold of being able to go, we can take this, simple, measurable step to trying to drive a safety outcome and see if it delivers a result. And I think that's the piece which just gets super, super exciting. Cool. Awesome. Well, hope everyone enjoyed that, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Misha.